In this video, we're going to take a look at tuples, which are sometimes referred to as arrays. In most languages, you have some type of an array. Actually, a string acts as an array. Array is a very generic term. And in Python, arrays are represented as tuples. Sometimes these are pronounced tuples. It depends on your pronunciation, usually dependent on which part of the country you're in. East Coast, often you hear the word tuple. West Coast, tuple. Makes no difference. Let's see, they're similar to strings in that they are a collection or sequence of values. The difference is strings are a collection of characters, whereas tuples can hold all kinds of different data. So let's give you an example here. I go through and make up a variable. I usually put in TPL in the prefix just to be transparent that it's a tuple. It's a personal choice. Just like me putting an str in front of a variable, it's just a personal choice. And then I go through and I put in any type of data I want. So let's say I want to put in an ID value, a name, a phone number, and maybe true or false whether they're a current customer. I could go through and do so by making a tuple up and putting in the ID, the name, the phone number, and true or false. And at that point, my tuple would have a collection of values under one variable, which is kind of convenient. They're pretty easy to set up. Just basically any type of data you want to collect. Now, if I print out want to print out or work with the individual values, I can do so by just going through and indicating their index value. So the 0th element of the collection or tuple, the first element of the tuple, the second, and finally the third. And this, of course, is just a way of holding multiple values. Tuples, as you can see, are very similar to how you might view a row of data in like a spreadsheet. So if I had an Excel spreadsheet here, I'd probably represent it as and now instead of just being one thing, it's actually a row of data. Now if I had put this all as a single string, then yeah, it would be considered a single item. By doing this, you're indicating that it's basically a row of individual values, in this case 4 individual values, with the index system starting off at 0, 1, 2, and 3. You might have used spreadsheets in the past. They certainly are a popular way of storing data, and just like how spreadsheets are really handy, tuples are as well. A couple things to note about tuples. Tuples don't require you to put parentheses, but if you do, it indicates that you want a tuple. If you leave them off, it's implied that you want a tuple. I'm not a real big fan of invisible code, but the fact is you need to know it will work. So if I do this, take off the parentheses, and I run it, I get the same exact thing. It still works, and when I print out the whole tuple, you can see that it still prints out with the parentheses. So it doesn't really change the fact. They have a name for this. They call it Tuple Packing. So if you want to, you can either put in parentheses or leave them off. I prefer using parentheses just because it makes it clearer that I'm actually using a tuple. That's also why I kind of use a prefix on my variables, just to be real clear, transparent about what I'm trying to accomplish. Of course, you can use a loop to loop through a tuple. We saw an example of that earlier. This would work the same way. for each item in that row of data, that tuple, I can print out the item. It doesn't matter whether or not I use it with parentheses or not. Both are going to end up as a tuple. So if I come back over here, and instead of printing them out individually like that, I can just automate the process for, how about we'll call it item. I guess just call it I because I'm lazy. In the tuple, print I. I don't have to type out the word item. In fact, a lot of people just use I to indicate that it's the item. It's become so common that you kind of think it's necessary because it shows up on so many web pages. But no, it's just basically just a made-up letter, made-up indicator that it's an individual item in there. If you have a tuple and you want to, you can unpack it. Now this is kind of unique to Python. Not all languages, very few languages I know of have it. It's not that no other ones do, but it is kind of unique. And the way it works is you take a tuple of data, you make up some variables, and it will unpack it. Remember that in programming, guys, it always goes from right to left. So the assignment is going to go from right to left. I'm going to take the data in the tuple and I'm going to put it, the 0th item will go in the 0th variable. First item will go in the first variable, second item will go in the second variable, third item will go in the third variable. And I can print it out. Like here I'm going through and say customer ID is, the customer ID, the 0th item, first, second, and third. And I just print it out accordingly. They call this unpacking, and it doesn't matter again whether or not, it doesn't matter whether or not you use the parentheses or not. Both of these are tuples, just one is using the tuple packing option, and the unpacking option is when you do this. So let's see here. I've got my tuple, we've printed it out. I'm going to go ahead and say I don't know, var1, comma, var2, var3, variable 3, sure I am, variable 4, and I'll just unpack it. And now if I print out, come on, you can see it prints out the 1. How about the third one? Prints out the phone number and so on. Put parentheses around here, and it still works. So you're just unpacking the tuple when you do this, and you'll see people do it in their Python code. It's not uncommon. Tuples can be collected into multidimensional tuples. Basically, you're just putting a tuple inside of a tuple or nesting the tuple. You can do this many levels down, but I gotta tell you, for the most part, you'll use a single list or collection of values, like a row of data, like a row in the spreadsheet, more often than you will pretty much any other choice. And when you do, this is considered a single row of data, a single dimensional tuple. However, if you wanted to, you could take a couple different rows and you could combine them as a group, and that would be 2 dimensions. It would have both length and height. Heck, for that matter, I could make a 3rd dimension by making another spreadsheet and putting some other data over here. It would have length, height, and I guess depth. After that, it's kind of tough for me to show you more than 3 using something like Excel. But I gotta tell you, using a single list of values or a row of values and a table of values is probably 95% of the time all you're ever going to need. If you can memorize how to make a list, a row and a table, you're golden for a long time. And you can look up anytime you want to use a third dimension or fourth dimension or fifth dimension. And they call them dimensions, but because they're really just collecting or nesting these items together. Here's an example. Here's one row of data. Here's my second row of data. I make a new tuple and I put those rows in there. And yeah, you've got yourself your basic table of data. In fact, I'm even just going to call it row 1, row 2, and table, just because it represents what I'm dealing with. This each row is considered a single dimension, and then the table collectively is it's nested inside of there as a second dimension. And what I mean by that is this has a tuple inside of it, so it's like nesting inside of it. They don't sometimes call it dimensions, or sometimes call them ranks. So there's a rank of 1, and then the tuple data table has a rank of 2. So tuple row has a rank of 1, table has a rank of 2. Row is a single dimensional array, table is a 2-dimensional array. This is a row, that is a table. Lots of ways of referring to the same thing. I think that's one of the reasons why programming seems so confusing when you start learning, is because there are so many different terms that seem to be exactly the same as the others. Like strings, tuples are technically immutable, but also like strings, you can change the value after the fact. The only thing is that you'll end up getting a different spot in memory, and for the most part you just don't care.
In this example, I start off with Bob in variable 1, and it's going to be pointing to, let's say, address 177. But if I later on use variable 1 again and concatenate the current value with a space with whatever's in V2, at that point V1 looks like it changes the actual value in memory. But what it really does is it makes a new spot in memory, in this case 342, and you end up with the final value in a new space in memory. Let's take another example, but this time with a tuple. So I start off with variable 1, and it has a tuple with values 1 and 2. Then I take variable 2 and I make a new tuple. Notice the comma after the 3 to make sure that it knows it's going to be a tuple. Without that comma, it won't work. Then I go ahead and add the tuples together. And what's going to happen is I'm going to end up with a new space in memory. So 15 was the original place where it was holding its value, but that gets replaced. V1 will now point to 555. Remember, I'm just making up these addresses. But the deal is that it looks like the tuple has expanded, but what's really happened is that it's just made a new space in memory.
I probably shouldn't copied and paste, because I can bring all kinds of weird artifacts, but let's see what we get here. So, okay, it's working like it should. It's printing out 1, 2, 3. Now, notice that I have a comma there. I'll go ahead and run it like this, and it's unhappy with this. It's kind of weird. You would think that it would see the parentheses. You would think that it would assume that that's a tuple. Instead, it assumes that it's an integer. It's looking at this, since it's it's just looking at this as an integer value. if I put an A in there, let's see what it does. Also looking at it as an integer or a string value. And I can't take a tuple and add a string to it. So what I have to do is I have to trick it into believing it's a tuple by putting a comma there. And I've always thought that was really weird. It also is something that students have like bang their head against the wall all weekend long trying to figure out how to take and add a tuple to another tuple. And it's this crazy little symbol there that will throw you off. Remember that the parentheses aren't necessary for creating the tuple. So you may see code like this. If I take that off, that won't work. But adding that on is enough to indicate that it's another tuple. And I can take two tuples and add them together. That's exactly what I did here. It's very much like strings except for that crazy comma there at the end to indicate that you're working with a tuple. Anyway, let's try a lab out. I'll come back and go through this in a minute, but mostly you just have to kind of work with this stuff. It's confusing at first. In no time at all, you won't even think about it. You'll just say, I got a collection of values. I want to put them under one variable name and use them as a collection. And tuples are handy for that. Until the next video, I'll talk to you later.